When the chains of duty snap, only the wild beast remains, and the one standing opposite you. Can an enemy become your only anchor in a darkness where every breath is a choice between loyalty to the past and the hunger to survive? We begin. The smell of raw, butchered meat was suffocating. It clung to the damp, heavy air of the forbidden forest, mixing with the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and the distinct sulphurous odor of a very large, very dangerous predator. Hermione Granger hoisted the levitation charm higher, her wand arm trembling as she guided the massive slab of beef over the knotted roots of an ancient oak. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the icy, resentful glare burning into the back of her neck, as tangible as the mist clinging to the trees. If you drop that, Granger, I am leaving you here as a substitute. The voice was a low, aristocratic drawl, completely stripped of its former boyhood arrogance, but entirely saturated with exhaustion and venom. Draco Malfoy. If you spent less time threatening me and more time maintaining the stasis charm on the rest of the supply, Malfoy, we wouldn't be slipping in blood. Hermione snapped back, her chest heaving as she navigated the treacherous terrain. They were a mile deep into the forest, far beyond the wards of Hogwarts. This was supposed to be simple. Hagrid had called it a favor. The Ministry had called it an essential component of Malfoy's post-war rehabilitation, a demonstration of community service and cooperation. Hermione, driven by an obnoxious, ingrained need to prove she could handle anything, had volunteered to supervise. It was the worst mistake she had made since the war ended. They rounded a thicket of thorn bushes, and there it was. The clearing was vast, fenced in by magically reinforced iron stakes that looked pathetically fragile. In the center, chained to a boulder the size of a small house, was Fluffy. The three-headed dog was older now, but age had not tempered his ferocity. It had only made him irritable, unpredictable, and entirely intolerant of strangers. Three massive heads lay resting on massive paws, eyes closed, breath rattling in a deep, bone-vibrating bass. "Quietly," Hermione whispered, lowering the meat toward the designated feeding trough. "Just slide it in, back away, and we're done for the day." Malfoy stepped up beside her, his pale face devoid of color, silver eyes fixed on the beast. He looked thin, almost brittle inside his dark, expensive robes that had no business being in a forest. The war had hollowed him out, leaving behind sharp edges and a volatile temper. "I know how to feed a bloody dog," he muttered, stepping past her to guide the second slab of meat. But he stepped on a dry branch. The snap echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. Instantly, the bass, heavy breathing stopped. 6 yellow eyes snapped open. A low, terrifying growl vibrated through the earth, traveling up Hermione's boots and settling in her ribs. "Malfoy," she breathed, freezing in place. "Don't move." "I'm not the one hyperventilating, Granger," he hissed back, though she saw the tremor in his wand hand. The middle head rose, jaws parting to reveal teeth the size of daggers, dripping with thick, foul-smelling saliva. It lunged, not at the meat, but at the movement, at Hermione. Time seemed to fracture. Hermione raised her wand, a shielding charm on her lips, but she was entirely too slow. The sheer mass of the beast eclipsed the grey sky. Then, a violent yank on her collar jerked her backward. She flew off her feet, crashing into a solid, unforgiving chest. A hand clamped around her waist, crushing her ribs, and they tumbled backward into the damp dirt just as massive jaws snapped shut on the empty air where she had been standing a fraction of a second before. The force of the dog's jaws clicking together sent a shock wave of wind across her face. They hit the ground hard, rolling into the underbrush. Hermione gasped for air, her senses overwhelmed by the smell of wet earth, the terrifying roars of the beast straining against its chain, and the sharp mint and cedar scent of the man currently plastered against her back. For one suspended, breathless second, there was only the frantic pounding of two hearts. Malfoy's arms were still locked around her, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps against her temple. He was trembling. The realization struck her like a physical blow. Draco Malfoy was terrified, and his instinct hadn't been to run, but to grab her. A sudden, jarring rush of warmth flooded her chest, a profound sense of shock at the raw protective action. She turned her head slightly, her lips parted, ready to speak, ready to acknowledge the vulnerability of the moment. But the second the immediate danger passed, the spell broke. Malfoy shoved her away as if she were made of acid. He scrambled to his feet, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. "Are you entirely brain-dead?" he snarled, brushing dirt from his robes with frantic, shaking hands. The warmth in Hermione's chest instantly crystallized into ice. "Excuse me," she demanded, pushing herself up from the mud, her knees bruised and aching. "I said, are you brain-dead? Did your Gryffindor courage finally rot the last remaining brain cell you possess?" His voice was rising, cracking with residual panic that he was desperately trying to convert into anger. "It was asleep. You were supposed to drop the meat and leave, not stand there staring down its throat like a sacrificial lamb." "You stepped on the branch!" Hermione shouted, the adrenaline morphing into white-hot fury. "You woke it up. I was trying to cast a shield charm." "A shield charm?" He let out a harsh, manic laugh, running a hand through his pale hair, destroying whatever perfectly coiffed image he was clinging to. "Against a Class XSSX beast, it would have bitten you in half, shield charm or not. But of course, the great Hermione Granger thinks she can out-magic a mountain of muscle and teeth. And you think you can just scream your way out of accountability," she fired back, stepping into his space, her finger jabbing at his chest. He flinched, a minute movement, but she caught it. "You almost got us both killed because you can't be bothered to watch where you're walking in your ridiculous dragonhide boots." "Don't touch me," he hissed, slapping her hand away. His eyes were wild, defensive, cornered. "I just saved your pathetic life, Granger. A little gratitude wouldn't kill you." "Gratitude? For fixing a mistake you made?" She laughed bitterly, though her chest ached. The memory of his arms around her was completely tainted now by his viciousness. It was always like this. Approach, then violently repel. He was a wounded animal snapping at anyone who got too close. "I didn't ask you to touch me. I didn't ask you to save me." "Believe me, it was a reflex. One I bitterly regret," he spat. They stood there, chests heaving, chests practically touching, glaring at each other through the damp, miserable mist. Fluffy was still thrashing and roaring in the background, fighting the heavy iron chains, but the sound felt secondary to the deafening silence roaring between them. The hostility was a physical wall, thick and impenetrable. Hermione turned on her heel, her jaw tight enough to crack. "Let's go. We need to set up the wards around the camp before dark." "I am not sharing a tent with you," Malfoy declared behind her, his tone final. "Then sleep in the rain, Malfoy. I don't care." She threw over her shoulder, marching away from the clearing. Her internal monologue was a chaotic mess of frustration. Why did he have to be so utterly impossible? Why did he have to save her, only to throw it in her face? And why, God help her, was her skin still burning where his hands had gripped her waist? She hated him. She hated his arrogance, his defensiveness, his broken, jagged edges that he used to cut anyone who tried to help him. But as she reached the edge of the clearing and began casting the protective enchantments for their small enforced campsite, she realized she was trembling too. 10 minutes later, Malfoy pushed through the flap of the enchanted tent. The space was magically expanded, but it still felt entirely too small. There were 2 cots, a small magical stove, and absolutely nowhere to hide. He didn't look at her. He stripped off his ruined outer robe, threw it onto his cot, and sat down, staring blankly at the canvas wall. The aristocratic sneer was gone, replaced by a hollow, exhausted emptiness that made Hermione's breath catch in her throat. Outside, the rain began to fall in heavy, drumming sheets, and a low, mournful howl echoed from the beast tied to the rock a mile away. They had 6 more days. 6 days of this cramped tent, of that monstrous dog, and of the terrifying, suffocating tension vibrating between them. Hermione sat on her own cot, clutching her wand, staring at his rigid back. The silence in the tent stretched, pulling tighter and tighter, a wire 1 breath away from snapping. She closed her eyes, the terrifying thoughts settling heavy in her mind. They were not going to survive this week, not without destroying each other first. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against the magically treated canvas of the tent did absolutely nothing to drown out the suffocating silence inside it. It had been 4 hours since the incident with Fluffy. 4 hours of Hermione sitting cross-legged on her narrow cot, staring at the pages of a book she wasn't actually reading, while Draco lay on his back on the opposite side of the small space, his forearm thrown over his eyes. He hadn't moved an inch. He hadn't spoken a word. Hermione's chest felt tight, constricted by a bizarre mixture of residual adrenaline and simmering resentment. Every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see the terrifying, gaping maw of the 3-headed dog. Instead, she felt the jarring impact of a solid chest against her back, the desperate, bruising grip of pale hands on her waist, and the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the boy who had spent his entire childhood mocking her very existence. He had saved her. It was a reflex, he had said, a bitter pill he clearly regretted swallowing. But reflexes were born of instinct, not calculation. Stripped of his family's wealth, his father's influence, and the poisonous ideology that had dictated his youth, what was Draco Malfoy's base instinct? To pull someone else out of the fire. The realization infuriated her. It made it impossible to simply hate him. It complicated things, and Hermione despised complications she couldn't neatly resolve in a textbook. She cast a covert glance over the top of her book. The dim, magical light of the tent cast harsh shadows across his sharp jawline and the hollows of his cheeks. The war had taken its toll on everyone, but on Malfoy the damage looked structural. He looked like a porcelain vase that had been shattered and glued back together by someone with shaking hands. One wrong tap, and he would splinter completely. "If you stare at me any longer, Granger, I'm going to assume you're planning my murder and preemptively hex you." His voice was a dry, raspy drawl, piercing the quiet of the tent without him even moving his arm from his eyes. Hermione flinched, her cheeks heating instantly. "I wasn't staring. You were boring a hole into my skull," he countered smoothly, finally lowering his arm and turning his head to look at her. His silver eyes caught the dim light, looking more like polished steel than anything human. "Spit it out. Whatever self-righteous Gryffindor lecture is rotting on your tongue, just say it so I can attempt to sleep." "I don't have a lecture, Malfoy," she said, her voice tight as she carefully marked her page and set the book aside. "I was just thinking. A dangerous pastime. Thinking about how we are supposed to survive the next 6 days if we can't even communicate without snapping at each other," she finished, ignoring his bait. She stood up, needing to move, to dissipate the nervous energy humming in her veins. She walked over to the small magical stove and began preparing tea, keeping her back to him. "We are supposed to be working together." "We aren't working together," he corrected coldly. "I am serving out my mandated ministry probation so they don't throw me back into a cell in Azkaban. You are here playing warden because your insufferable savior complex won't let you leave well enough alone." The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, screaming sound that perfectly mirrored the tension in the room. Hermione poured the boiling water into 2 mugs with jerky, angry motions. She turned around, holding one out to him. "I am not your warden, and I don't have a savior complex," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I volunteered because Hagrid asked, and because I thought, foolishly apparently, that maybe after surviving a war that nearly destroyed us all, we could manage to feed a dog without killing each other." Malfoy looked at the mug of tea in her hand, then up at her face. For a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Exhaustion, maybe, or a profound, echoing loneliness. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the familiar defensive sneer. He didn't take the tea. "I don't want anything from you." The warmth that had tentatively begun to blossom in her chest at the thought of a truce instantly plummeted to absolute zero. She set the mug down on the small wooden table between their cots with a hard thunk. "Fine. Starve. Freeze. Keep acting like a petulant child. But tomorrow you will follow my lead with the feeding, or I will write to the probation committee myself." He scoffed, rolling over to face the canvas wall. "Turn out the light, Granger." She extinguished the lantern with a sharp flick of her wand, plunging the tent into absolute darkness. She lay back on her cot, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. The rain battered the roof. In the distance, Fluffy let out another long, pathetic howl that vibrated through the muddy earth. Hermione closed her eyes, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. It was going to be a very long week. Hermione woke with a gasp, her hand instantly flying to the wand beneath her pillow. The tent was pitch black, the air freezing cold. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, but it wasn't the weather that had woken her. It was a sound. She held her breath, straining her ears over the ambient noise of the forest. It wasn't the snapping of branches, and it wasn't the deep, rattling breath of the 3-headed dog. It was a melody, faint, airy, and unspeakably sad. She sat up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. Malfoy's cot was empty. The blankets were thrown aside, the canvas flap of the tent tied loosely, letting in the biting night air. Frowning, Hermione slipped out of bed, pulling her thick wool sweater tightly around herself. She stepped into her boots and pushed through the tent flap, her wand held at the ready. The forest was bathed in the eerie, silver light of a half-moon fighting its way through the cloud cover. She followed the sound, stepping carefully over the wet roots, staying strictly within the boundaries of their protective wards. She found him standing near the edge of the magical barrier, looking out toward the dark clearing where Fluffy was chained. Malfoy was completely drenched. He wore only his black trousers and a thin white button-down shirt that was plastered to his skin by the rain. But he didn't seem to notice the cold. In his hands, he held a simple, beautifully carved wooden flute. He was playing. The notes drifted into the damp air, weaving a spell of profound melancholy. It was a lullaby, slow and hypnotic. And as Hermione looked past him through the trees, she saw the silhouette of the massive beast in the clearing. Fluffy wasn't thrashing anymore. The giant dog was lying flat on the ground, all three massive heads resting heavily on his paws, his eyes drooping as the haunting melody washed over him. Hermione stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She had never seen this Draco Malfoy. She knew he played the piano. It was a requirement of his aristocratic upbringing. But this was different. This wasn't a performance. This was raw, bleeding emotion poured into a cheap piece of wood to soothe a terrifying, broken creature. A profound wave of empathy crashed over her. She saw him not as the boy who had mocked her, or the man who had shoved her away hours ago, but as someone deeply, fundamentally wounded, recognizing the pain in another caged animal. She took a step forward. A twig snapped under her boot. The music stopped abruptly. Malfoy whipped around, the flute dropping to his side. His pale eyes widened in shock for a split second before a terrifying defensive fury slammed down like an iron portcullis over his features. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice lethal, cutting through the cold air. I woke up," Hermione stammered, stepping closer, holding her hands up in a placating gesture. The seesaw tipped wildly. She wanted to bridge the gap. She wanted to tell him it was beautiful. "Draco, Do not call me that," he snarled, taking a step back as if her approach physically burned him. His hands were shaking again, but this time with pure rage. He shoved the flute into his pocket, his posture rigid. "I just wanted to see what the noise was," she said softly, keeping her voice even, trying to project the warmth she felt. "It was beautiful. It was putting him to sleep. I didn't know you cared." "Cared?" The word erupted from him like a curse. He closed the "is me" caring. "You think this is some is me caring? You think this is some touching, redemptive moment where the evil Death Eater shows his soft side to the mud, to the golden girl?" He caught himself just in time, but the phantom's slur hung heavily in the air between them, sharp as a knife. Hermione recoiled, the empathy shattering into a million icy pieces. "That's not what I—" "Stop analyzing me," he shouted, the sound echoing dangerously loud in the quiet forest. "Stop looking at me like I'm one of your pathetic, broken projects. I am not a stray you can fix, Granger. I don't need your pity. I don't need your understanding. And I certainly don't need you spying on me in the middle of the night." "I wasn't spying on you," she yelled back, her own temper flaring, the cold returning with a vengeance. I heard a noise. Excuse me for thinking my assigned partner might have been eaten by a Class X beast while he was wandering around in the dark. I survived a war living with a madman in my house. I can handle a bloody dog, he spat. Just stay away from me. Stay on your side of the tent, do your little checklist, and leave me alone. If you look at me with that pathetic, bleeding heart pity again, I swear to God, Granger, I will walk out of these wards and let the Ministry throw me in Azkaban. At least the Dementors are honest about wanting to destroy you. He didn't wait for a response. He pushed past her, his shoulder intentionally clipping hers hard enough to make her stumble, and stalked back toward the tent. Hermione stood alone in the freezing rain, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in visible white puffs. The physical sting in her shoulder was nothing compared to the violent emotional whiplash she had just endured. He had opened a door, let her see a glimpse of the bruised, beating heart inside him, and the moment she acknowledged it, he had slammed it shut, nearly crushing her fingers in the process. She looked out toward the clearing. Fluffy was awake again, shifting restlessly, a low, agitated growl rumbling in the dark. The truce was dead. The war between them had just been dragged out into the open, and Hermione, shivering in the cold, realized with a terrifying jolt that she was no longer just fighting to survive the beast in the forest. She was fighting to survive the boy in the tent. And God help her. She needed to know what lay beneath the armor. She needed to break him open. Day 2 broke not with sunlight, but with a bruised, suffocating twilight that barely penetrated the dense canopy of the forbidden forest. The rain had intensified, transforming the ground around their camp into a treacherous mire. Inside the tent, the silence was no longer just awkward. It was militant. It was a physical entity, heavy and armed, occupying the meager space between their cots. Hermione lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the rhythmic, aggressive drumming of the downpour. She hadn't slept a wink since their confrontation in the woods. Her mind, endlessly analytical, had spent the dark hours dissecting every word Draco had screamed at her. "Stop looking at me like I'm one of your pathetic, broken projects." The accusation stung with the undeniable burn of truth. She hated to admit it, but her Gryffindor conditioning had flared the moment she saw him playing that flute. She had wanted to understand him, to fix the shattered pieces of his psyche, to validate his hidden humanity. But Draco Malfoy wasn't a broken magical artifact waiting for Hermione Granger to cast a repairing charm. He was a survivor of a brutal psychological war, trapped in a house with a monster, forced to commit atrocities under the threat of his family's execution. His defenses were high because they had kept him alive. Her pity wasn't a balm. It was a threat to the armor he relied on. The core conflict of their survival was glaringly obvious now. They could not function on pity or hostility. To survive Fluffy, and to survive this week, they had to establish a baseline of operational trust. But how do you build trust with someone whose primary instinct is to bite the hand that reaches for them? Across the tent, the rustle of coarse blankets signaled that Draco was up. Hermione kept her breathing even, watching him through half-closed eyes. He moved with a stiff, deliberate, mechanical energy, his pale face an unreadable mask of occlumency. He dressed in thick, dark layers, spelling his boots impervious to the mud without glancing in her direction. "The meat is charmed. We leave in 5 minutes," he stated to the empty air, his voice devoid of any inflection. The icy repulsion from last night had settled into a glacial professional detachment. "Understood," Hermione replied, matching his clinical tone. She threw off her blankets, suppressing a shiver as the damp cold of the tent bit into her skin. The trek to the clearing was a nightmare. The forest floor was a slick, shifting nightmare of mud and rotting leaves. They walked in single file, Draco leading the way, silently carving a path through the dense, thorny underbrush with sharp, wordless slashes of his wand. The physical distance between them was only a few feet, but emotionally, they were standing on opposite sides of a canyon. When they finally reached the perimeter of the iron stakes, the situation was visibly deteriorating. Fluffy was profoundly agitated. The sudden drop in barometric pressure and the relentless rain had set the beast on edge. All 3 heads were pacing as much as the massive iron chains would allow, the ground vibrating with low, continuous, thunderous growls. "He's not going to just let us levitate the food into the trough today," Hermione shouted over the roar of the wind, stepping up beside Draco. She analyzed the beast's movements, the erratic twitching of the tails, the flared nostrils. "He's hyper-vigilant. Any sudden movement with our wands and he'll lunge." Draco's jaw locked. His silver eyes tracked the dog's frantic pacing, his knuckles white around the handle of his hawthorn wand. "Then we don't use wands, not for the final delivery." Hermione turned to him, horrified. "Are you insane? We can't walk it up to him. If we cross the ward line manually. If we levitate it, the magic traces will set him off," Draco interrupted, his voice sharp and authoritative, entirely stripping away the petulant boy from yesterday. This was the tactician. "We levitate the meat to the edge of the ward. Then we drop the spells, drag the slabs to the trough by hand, and get out before he realizes we've breached his radius. That requires us to be completely synchronized. If one of us is slower, the other gets eaten," she pointed out, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was looking for a crack in his resolve, a sign of the panic from yesterday, but there was nothing, just cold, hard calculation. "Then don't be slow, Granger." It wasn't an insult. It was a statement of fact. He was placing his physical safety directly in her hands, entirely dependent on her ability to keep pace with him. The seesaw shifted violently. He was offering a terrifying, practical form of trust. Hermione swallowed hard, nodding once. "Fine. On 3. They unsealed the stasis charms on the massive slabs of raw meat. The smell hit the air, and Fluffy instantly zeroed in on them, 6 yellow eyes locking onto their position. The growling escalated into a deafening, chest-rattling roar. "1!" Draco called out, his wand raised. Hermione mirrored his stance. 2! The sky above them darkened ominously, black clouds swirling violently. 3! They moved. Together they levitated the heavy meat, guiding it swiftly through the pouring rain to the edge of the magical boundary. As one, they slashed their wands downward, cancelling the charms. The meat hit the mud with a wet, heavy thud. Instantly, Draco holstered his wand and grabbed the thick rope tied around his slab. Hermione did the same. They stepped over the invisible ward line. The air changed immediately. It felt heavier, charged with the raw, predatory magic of the beast. Fluffy lunged, the chains pulling taut with a horrific metallic screech. The center head snapped its jaws mere feet from Draco's shoulder, foul saliva spraying across his dark robes. "Keep moving!" Draco yelled, his boots slipping in the mud as he hauled the meat toward the stone trough. Hermione dragged her slab, her muscles screaming in protest. The right head swung toward her, jaws wide, but she didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on Draco's rhythm, matching his grueling pace step for step. They reached the trough simultaneously, dumping the meat inside. "Back!" Draco roared. They scrambled backward just as Fluffy descended on the trough, a chaotic flurry of teeth, tearing flesh and bone-crushing snarls. They threw themselves back across the ward line, collapsing into the wet underbrush, chests heaving, gasping for air. Hermione wiped a mixture of rain and mud from her eyes, looking over at Draco. He was covered in filth, his hair plastered to his forehead, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a fraction of a second, there was a shared spark of triumph, a silent, breathless acknowledgement that they had just executed a flawless, life-threatening maneuver without a single misstep. The glacial ice between them cracked, letting a rush of warm, adrenaline-fueled camaraderie bleed through. Then, the sky tore open. A jagged fork of blinding white lightning struck the ancient oak tree on the far side of the clearing. The deafening crack of thunder was instantaneous, shaking the very bedrock beneath them. The tree exploded, showering the clearing in burning, splintered wood. Fluffy panicked. The beast abandoned the food, rearing up on its hind legs with a roar of absolute terror. The sheer force of its panic snapped the rusted iron rung anchoring the primary chain to the boulder. "He's loose!" Hermione screamed, sheer terror paralyzing her vocal cords. "Granger, move!" Draco was on his feet in an instant. He didn't run away. He lunged forward, grabbing Hermione by the front of her soaked sweater and hauled her violently to her feet. The ground beneath them was giving way, the heavy rain and the dogs thrashing, turning the embankment into a sliding river of mud. "Where?" she cried, stumbling as he dragged her toward the dense rock face bordering the eastern side of the clearing. "There." He pointed frantically toward a narrow, dark fissure in the solid granite, a hollowed-out alcove formed by a collapsed cave system. They sprinted, slipping and sliding, the roars of the terrified, massive dog echoing right behind them. Fluffy was thrashing blindly, giant paws tearing up massive chunks of earth. One of the loose chains whipped through the air, smashing into the ground inches from Hermione's heel. Draco shoved her roughly into the fissure, diving in immediately after her, just as a massive, clawed paw slammed into the rock face outside, shaking the stone and showering them in dirt and debris. The alcove was impossibly small. It was barely wide enough for one person, let alone two. They were crushed together, pressed chest to chest in the pitch-black darkness of the crevice. The cold stone bit into Hermione's back, but she barely felt it. All she could feel was Draco. His body was pressed flush against hers, rigid and tense. His arms were braced against the rock on either side of her head, caging her in to prevent her from falling forward out of the fissure. The air was violently, suddenly sucked out of the space, replaced entirely by the heat radiating from his soaked clothes and the frantic, hammering rhythm of his heart against her breastbone. Outside, the storm raged and the beast roared. But inside the narrow gap in the stone, The world shrank down to a suffocating, electrifying point of absolute proximity. "Are you hurt?" Draco whispered. His voice was rough, entirely stripped of its usual defenses, trembling slightly as his warm breath brushed across her cheek in the dark. Hermione couldn't breathe. The seesaw had snapped. The cold repulsion of the morning was gone, obliterated by the overwhelming, dizzying warmth of his body, shielding hers from the storm. She looked up, barely able to make out the pale silhouette of his face, inches from her own, his eyes wide and searching in the shadows. The tension between them had completely mutated. It was no longer the sharp, jagged edge of hostility. It was heavy, magnetic, and unspeakably dangerous. "No," she breathed back, her voice barely a tremor. "I'm okay." He didn't move away. He couldn't, but he didn't try to either. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, and the atmosphere in the tiny alcove shifted from survival to something deeply, terrifyingly intimate. Hermione felt a sudden, desperate ache in her chest, a burning need to know exactly what would happen if the distance between them closed entirely. The air in the fissure was thick, heavily saturated with the scent of wet earth, ozone, and the sharp, undeniable musk of Draco Malfoy's panic. Outside, the storm was a living, breathing entity, tearing the sky apart with blinding flashes of white and concussive blasts of thunder. Fluffy's maddened roars shook the very bedrock beneath their boots, but Hermione couldn't hear any of it. The world had narrowed down to the fraction of an inch separating her lips from Draco's. He was staring at her mouth, his chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow gasps against hers. The pale, aristocratic face that usually held nothing but contempt was entirely stripped of its armor. His silver eyes were wide, dark, and utterly unguarded. The magnetic pull between them was horrifyingly strong, an invisible, gravitational force dragging them across enemy lines. Hermione's mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, went completely blank. She could feel the heat of his hands braced against the stone on either side of her face, caging her in. She could feel the frantic, heavy rhythm of his heartbeat, transferring through her soaked sweater, matching her own pulse beat for beat. She wanted it. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wanted him to bridge that final, impossible gap. She wanted to know what the friction of his anger felt like when it was channeled into something else. She tilted her chin up, an involuntary, infinitesimal surrender. Draco's breath hitched. His eyelashes fluttered shut, and he leaned in, his face descending toward hers, the warmth of his mouth a ghost against her own. And then a massive, clawed paw slammed against the granite outside their alcove, sending a violent shudder through the stone and a shower of grit raining down upon them. The spell shattered. Draco jerked back so violently the back of his skull connected with the rock face behind him with a sickening thud. He didn't even seem to register the pain. He practically recoiled from her, pressing himself as far into the jagged crevices of the stone as the narrow space would allow. The unguarded vulnerability in his eyes vanished, instantly replaced by a terrifying glacial panic. "Don't," he gasped out, his voice a harsh, scraped whisper. He threw one arm across his chest, a physical barrier between them. "Don't do that." The seesaw violently slammed down. The suffocating warmth that had enveloped Hermione evaporated, leaving her freezing in her damp clothes. Her cheeks burned with a sudden, humiliating fire. "I didn't do anything," she shot back, her voice shaking, desperately trying to scramble back behind her own walls. "You looked at me like—" He choked on the words, dragging a shaking hand through his wet hair. His jaw clenched, the muscles working furiously as he hastily rebuilt the ruins of his composure. When he looked back at her, his eyes were flat, cold, and cruel. "Don't confuse a massive dump of adrenaline with anything real, Granger. We almost died. Your nervous system is just misfiring." "My nervous system?" Hermione laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed off the damp stone. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, suddenly painfully aware of how small the space was. "You were the one leaning in, Malfoy. Don't you dare project your own pathetic panic onto me just because you're terrified of acting like a human being for 5 consecutive seconds." "I am terrified," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom, "of what the Ministry would do to my probation if I strangled their golden girl in a cave. Keep your Gryffindor delusions to yourself." The words were meant to cut, and they did, slicing neatly through the fragile, raw connection they had just shared. Hermione bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. He was impossible. He was a coward. Every time they took a step forward, every time she saw the terrified, lonely boy beneath the monster he pretended to be, he lashed out and destroyed it. "You are unbelievable," she whispered, her voice tight with unshed angry tears. "You'd rather freeze to death in your own misery than admit you actually feel something." He didn't answer. He just turned his head away, staring out at the sliver of grey light visible through the crack in the stone. The silence between them turned toxic, heavy with unspoken accusations and the bitter residue of a moment aborted too soon. Outside, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The heavy downpour was turning the ground outside their fissure into a river of mud. Worse, the frantic thrashing of the beast had slowed. The mindless panic was subsiding, replaced by a focused, predatory intent. A massive shadow fell over the narrow opening of their alcove. Hermione froze. Draco stiffened, his hand instinctively flying to his pocket, not his wand holster. A wet, leathery snout the size of a barrel shoved its way into the crack. The sound of deep, wet sniffing filled the small space, horribly loud and wet. The dog was hunting them. The center head let out a low, vibrating growl that shook the dust from the ceiling of the cave. It couldn't fit its head inside, but a massive, iron-hard claw suddenly jammed through the opening, scraping blindly against the rock, searching for soft flesh. "Get back!" Draco hissed, grabbing her shoulder and shoving her deeper into the wedge of the cave, placing his own body between her and the blindly swiping claw. "We can't stay here," Hermione breathed, pressing herself flat against the cold stone, her heart hammering wildly. "If he digs away the loose rock at the entrance, he'll rip us out of here, or the mudslide will drown us." "I know," Draco said, his voice stripped of the cruel mockery from a moment ago. He was the tactician again, his mind working furiously. "We have to subdue him. The primary chain is snapped, but the secondary binding on his hind legs is still anchored to the boulder. If we can get him back to the center of the clearing, we can repair the main link." "Subdue him? Draco? We can't out-magic him. Our spells will just bounce off his hide and enrage him more." "Not yours," he said, turning to face her. The sliver of light caught his face, highlighting the grim, terrified determination set into his features. "I'm not using my wand." He pulled his hand out of his pocket. In his long, trembling fingers, he held the carved wooden flute. Hermione stared at it, the memory of his haunting melody in the dark forest rushing back. "You want to play it now, in the middle of a thunderstorm, with him trying to dig us out?" "It worked on him yesterday," Draco said, his voice tight. "Music puts him to sleep. If I can get his attention, if I can just get him to focus on the melody, his nervous system will force him to calm down. But I have to be out there, in the open. If I play it in here, the acoustics will distort the sound." Hermione's blood ran cold. "If you step out there, he will tear you to pieces before you can play a single note." "That," Draco said, looking directly into her eyes, "is where you come in." The seesaw halted, balancing precariously in the center. He was looking at her not with hostility, not with panic, but with absolute raw necessity. "I need you to draw his fire, Granger," he said quietly, the heavy rain masking the tremor in his words. "You have to step out first, cast a distraction, lure all three heads toward the far side of the clearing. Give me 10 seconds to get to the boulder and start playing. Once the music hits him, he'll slow down. When his eyes droop, you have exactly 3 seconds to cast the heaviest incarcerus you know, to bind his front paws before he fights the spell." Hermione stared at him, horrified. "You're asking me to act as bait." "I'm asking you to trust me," he corrected, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "Trust." The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. He was asking her to step in front of a Class XXXX beast with nothing but a wand that was practically useless against its hide. He was asking her to bet her life on his ability to play a child's instrument in the middle of a hurricane. But more than that, he was placing his own life entirely in her hands. If her binding spell failed, he would be standing completely defenseless in front of the beast, his hands occupied with a flute instead of a wand. It was a mutual surrender, a complete, terrifying leap of faith. She looked at his pale, strained face. She saw the boy who had pulled her out of the way of the snapping jaws on their first day. She saw the boy who had played a lullaby in the freezing rain because he understood what it meant to be a terrified animal. And despite the stinging rejection just moments prior, she knew he wouldn't let her die. Her Gryffindor courage, which he so deeply despised, flared, but it wasn't driven by a savior complex. It was driven by him. 10 seconds, Hermione said, her voice steadying, locking her brown eyes onto his silver ones. She drew her wand, the wood warming instantly in her grip. "You had better play like your life depends on it, Malfoy, because mine does." A muscle feathered in his jaw. He didn't offer a sarcastic retort. He simply nodded, his grip tightening on the wooden flute. "On my mark," Hermione whispered, turning toward the narrow opening of the fissure, where the beast's claw was still frantically scraping against the stone. She took a deep breath, pushing the terror down, letting the pure, focused adrenaline take over. The hostility was gone. The cold was gone. There was only the thundering storm, the raging beast, and the fragile, terrifying thread of trust binding them together in the dark. "Go." Hermione didn't think. If she thought, she would die. She threw herself through the narrow fissure, the jagged stone catching on her sweater and tearing it as she rolled out into the chaotic, rain-drenched clearing. The mud was a freezing slurry that swallowed her boots, but she scrambled to her feet, her wand already slashing through the air. "Hey! Over here, you overgrown rug!" she shrieked, her voice cracking against the roar of the wind. She cast a bombarda at a pile of rocks 30 feet to the right of the dog. The explosion was deafening, a fountain of grey stone and sparks erupting into the sky. It worked. All 3 of Fluffy's massive heads whipped around, their focus snapped away from the alcove. 6 yellow eyes, dilated with primal panic, locked onto the small, solitary figure standing in the open. The beast let out a collective roar that rattled Hermione's teeth in her skull. It began to bound toward her, its massive paws thudding like falling boulders. 1, 2. She counted under her breath, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She cast a confringo into the mud directly in front of the beast, creating a wall of fire and debris to slow its path. The dog hesitated for a fraction of a second, the heads snapping at each other in confusion. 3, 4. From the corner of her eye, she saw a blur of black movement. Draco had bolted from the fissure, his body low to the ground as he sprinted toward the massive central boulder. He looked fragile against the backdrop of the storm, a pale ghost haunting the woods. He reached the rock just as Fluffy realized the fire was a trick. The beast lunged, its central head dipping low, jaws open wide enough to swallow her whole. 5, 6. Hermione's wand arm was shaking violently now. She cast a series of blinding lumos sparks directly into the dog's eyes. It was a pathetic defense, but it forced the heads to recoil, shaking themselves in irritation. 7, 8. She was out of room. Her back hit a thick, ancient trunk at the edge of the clearing. Fluffy was less than 10 feet away. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the rot on his breath. The middle head lunged, the snap of its teeth sounding like a guillotine. 9. Then, through the cacophony of the storm, came a sound so out of place it felt like a hallucination. High, clear, and hauntingly beautiful, the notes of the wooden flute pierced through the thunder. The change in the beast was instantaneous. The middle head, which had been a second away from crushing Hermione's torso, froze. The other 2 heads tilted, their ears twitching. The aggressive, jagged energy radiating from the creature began to smooth out, like oil poured onto turbulent water. Draco was standing atop the flat surface of the boulder, his wet shirt clinging to his ribs, his eyes closed. He looked like a statue of a fallen angel, playing a lament for the world. He didn't look at the dog. He didn't look at the danger. He poured every ounce of his focus into the melody. It was a soft, weaving song, full of minor keys and echoing loneliness. Hermione watched, paralyzed, as the massive dog's legs began to buckle. The terrifying, predatory yellow eyes began to glaze over. The tails stopped lashing. Slowly, with a series of deep, rattling sighs, the 3 heads descended toward the mud. "Now, Granger!" Draco's voice cracked through the music for a split second, though he never stopped playing. He used his foot to kick the heavy iron chain toward her. Hermione acted on pure instinct. She didn't use the standard incarcerus. She channeled every bit of her terror, her adrenaline, and the strange electric heat still humming in her veins from their time in the cave into a powerful, modified binding spell. Vincere Maxima! Thick, glowing ropes of magical energy erupted from her wand, weaving themselves into the heavy iron links of the broken chain. The magic hummed with a blue-white light, soldering the metal back together and anchoring it deep into the bedrock of the boulder. The dog let out a final, drowsy groan and collapsed into a deep, enchanted sleep. The silence that followed was deafening. The rain continued to fall, but the violence had left the air. Draco slowly lowered the flute. He stood on top of the rock for a long moment, his chest heaving, looking down at the sleeping monster. Then he slid down the side of the stone, his legs giving out the moment his boots hit the mud. Hermione stumbled toward him, her own strength deserting her. She collapsed onto her knees in front of him, the two of them breathing in syncopated, ragged gasps. "We did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Draco looked up. His face was a mess of mud and rain, his hair plastered to his forehead in silver streaks. He looked at her, really looked at her, without the sneer, without the walls, without the biting sarcasm. For the first time in 7 years, he looked at her as an equal. "You didn't run," he said, his voice raspy and thick with emotion. "Neither did you." The seesaw tilted again, but this time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a bridge. The warmth returned, but it wasn't the frantic, panicked heat of the cave. It was something deeper, steadier, a recognition of shared trauma and shared triumph. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and tentatively touched his arm. "Draco." He flinched, but he didn't pull away. His skin was freezing, but where she touched him, a spark of heat ignited. He looked down at her hand, his expression unreadable, then back up at her face. The tension from the alcove was back, but the cruelty was gone. The air between them felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Then the old Malfoy flickered back for a second, his eyes narrowing as he regained his bearings. He pulled his arm back, but the movement was slow, almost reluctant. "Don't get used to it, Granger," he muttered, though the bite was missing from his tone. "I still think you're a mental, reckless Gryffindor. And I still think you're a dramatic, oversensitive Slytherin," she countered, a small, tired smile tugging at her lips. He huffed a laugh, a real, genuine sound that startled them both. He stood up, offering her a hand. Hermione took it, and he hauled her to her feet with a strength that surprised her. For a moment, they stood there in the mud, hands linked, the sleeping beast behind them and the dark forest around them. The betrayal of his earlier rejection in the cave still hummed in the back of her mind, a warning that he would likely retreat again once the sun came up. He was a master of the approach and the repulsion. But as they began the slow walk back to the tent, Draco didn't let go of her hand for several long seconds. They reached the campsite in total silence. The fire had gone out, and the tent looked small and fragile against the towering trees. Draco stopped at the entrance, turning to face her. The shadows under his eyes looked like bruises. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Get dry. I'll check the perimeter wards." "Draco, you're freezing. You need to get out of those clothes." "I'm fine, Hermione." Her name. He had said her name. It felt like a spell in itself, vibrating in the air between them. The warmth flooded back into her, making her dizzy. She stepped closer, her hand rising to brush a stray, wet lock of hair from his forehead. He froze. His breath hitched, and for a heartbeat, he leaned into her touch, his eyes fluttering shut. The repulsion was gone. The trust was there, raw and bleeding. But as she moved to close the distance, As she saw his lips part in an invitation he was too proud to speak, he suddenly jerked his head back. The ice returned to his eyes so quickly it was like a physical slap. "Get in the tent," he ordered, his voice cold and hard as granite. The whiplash was agonizing. Hermione's hand dropped to her side. The anger flared up again, hotter than ever. "Fine. Be a martyr. Freeze to death out here for all I care." She turned and stormed into the tent, ripping the flap closed behind her. She stripped off her wet outer layers with shaking hands, her mind screaming. She hated him. She hated how he could make her feel like the most important person in the world one second and a nuisance the next. She crawled into her cot, pulling the blankets over her head, her heart a tangled mess of fury and longing. She listened to his footsteps outside, pacing the perimeter back and forth, back and forth. She needed to know what he was so afraid of. She needed to know why he kept pushing her away just as she was getting close. And as she drifted into a restless, exhausted sleep, she made a silent vow. She wasn't going to let him retreat again. By the time they left this forest, she would break his silence, or she would break him. But outside, in the dark, Draco Malfoy stood in the rain, clutching his wooden flute so hard the wood groaned, whispering her name to the empty trees like a confession he could never take back. He knew he was losing the war against himself, and the thought terrified him more than the beast in the clearing ever could. The 6th day was coming, and with it the end of their isolation. He just had to survive the feeling of her eyes on him for 48 more hours. He just had to keep the wall up, but the wall was crumbling, and they both knew it. The 5th day arrived with a treacherous, mocking stillness. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a forest that felt alien, too quiet, too bright, and far too humid. The steam rose from the forest floor in ghostly plumes, curling around the trees like skeletal fingers. Inside the tent, the atmosphere had shifted from militant silence to something far more volatile, a heavy, electric awareness. Hermione sat at the small table, nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't look at Draco, yet she knew exactly where he was. She could hear the rustle of his parchment, the scratch of his quill as he filled out his mandatory probation log, and the occasional sharp intake of breath that told her he was fighting a headache. Every time he shifted in his seat, the air in the tent seemed to hum with the memory of the previous night. The flute, the mud, the way he had said her name. The seesaw was no longer swinging. It was vibrating. "You're doing it again," Draco said, his voice cutting through the humid air. It wasn't a snap this time. It was a weary, almost resigned observation. Hermione didn't look up. Doing what? Calculating. Analyzing the data to find the most efficient way to break me. He finally set his quill down and turned his chair to face her. The sunlight filtering through the canvas highlighted the sharp angles of his face, the dark circles under his eyes, and the sheer, raw exhaustion he could no longer hide. "Save your breath, Granger. We're done in 48 hours. Let's just finish the task and never speak of this again." The coldness of his words should have repelled her. It should have sent her back to the safety of her books. But Hermione saw the way his fingers were twitching against his knees. He was lying. He was terrified of the very silence he was trying to enforce. "Why are you so determined to be alone?" she asked softly, finally meeting his gaze. You spent a year in a house full of people who wanted to kill you or use you. Now you're out, and you're still building a cage. Draco's eyes flashed with a sudden, jagged heat. I'm not building a cage. I'm building a fortification. There's a difference. Is there? She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floorboards. She took a step toward him, emboldened by the lack of a sneer on his face. Because from where I'm standing, you look like you're suffocating. You let me in for 5 minutes yesterday, Draco. You saved me. You played that music. You looked at me like... Like what? He challenged, standing up to meet her. He was much taller, his shadow looming over her in the cramped space. But she didn't back down. The proximity was a repeat of the alcove, but this time there was no monster outside to blame for the racing of her pulse. Like I forgot who I was. Like I forgot that I'm a pariah and you're a saint. That was the adrenaline, Granger. I told you. Stop using that as an excuse, she shouted, the frustration finally boiling over. I felt it. You felt it. You're so busy trying to protect yourself from the world that you're missing the fact that the world has already moved on. I don't pity you, Draco. I don't think you're a project. I think you're a man who is incredibly brave when he's not being a coward about his own heart. The silence that followed was a physical weight. Draco's face went white, whiter than she had ever seen it. His jaw tightened so hard she heard the bone click. For a moment, she thought he was going to walk out, to disappear into the woods and let the wards take him. Instead, he stepped closer. He moved into her personal space, his chest inches from hers, his breath hot and uneven. You think I'm brave? He whispered, his voice dangerously low, vibrating with a mixture of fury and something that sounded suspiciously like despair. You think it's brave to want things you have no right to touch, to look at someone like you, someone who represents everything I was taught to hate, but who is the only thing that makes me feel like I'm not a ghost, and know that if I reach out, I'll only pull you down into the mud with me. The confession was so raw, so utterly devoid of his usual artifice, that it left Hermione breathless. This was the betrayal he feared, the betrayal of his own resolve. I can stand in the mud, Draco. I've been. I can stand in the mud, Draco. I've been doing it for years. He looked down at her hand, his eyes darkening. The seesaw tipped toward warmth, toward a terrifying, beautiful approach. He reached out, his fingers grazing the skin of her throat, a touch so light it was almost a hallucination. Hermione leaned into it, her eyes fluttering shut, the world around them dissolving, until there was only the heat of his skin and the smell of cedar and rain. But then the ground beneath them groaned. A massive, wet thud echoed from the direction of the clearing, followed by a series of high-pitched, agonizing yelps. Not the roars of a predator, but the cries of a creature in pain. Draco jerked his hand away as if she had burned him. The repulsion was instantaneous, a reflex born of shame and the sudden intrusion of reality. "Fluffy," he choked out, his voice snapping back into its icy professional mask. "Something's wrong," Hermione said, shaking off the daze, her mind pivoting back to the mission. That didn't sound like he was waking up. That sounded like he was hurt. They scrambled out of the tent, the romantic tension replaced by a grim, shared purpose. They ran through the steaming woods, the mud sticking to their boots. When they reached the clearing, The sight was horrific. The storm hadn't just loosened the rocks, it had caused a localized sinkhole beneath the massive boulder Fluffy was anchored to. The heavy stone had shifted, sliding into a depression in the earth and dragging the dog with it. One of Fluffy's front paws was pinned beneath the edge of the granite, and the secondary chain on his hind leg had twisted, cutting deep into his hock. The beast was thrashing, but weakly, his 3 heads lolling in exhaustion and pain. "The boulder is still moving," Draco observed, his eyes scanning the terrain with clinical precision. "The mud is too soft. If it slides another foot, it'll crush his leg entirely, or worse, sever the artery." "We have to lift it," Hermione said, her wand already out. "A Wingardium Leviosa won't be enough for that much mass, not with the suction of the mud. We'll need a combined Mobilis Corpus and a localized freezing charm on the mud to create a stable base," Draco said, stepping up beside her. He looked at her then, a quick, sharp look that conveyed a world of unspoken understanding. The trust they had built in the storm was their only weapon now. They took their positions. "On 3, Hermione commanded. 1, 2, 3. They cast simultaneously. The effort was immense. Hermione felt the drain on her magic immediately, a cold ache spreading through her core as she fought to move the multi-ton rock. Draco was chanting beside her, his face contorted with effort, his wand arm shaking. The boulder groaned, shifting an inch, 2 inches. "Hold it!" Draco grunted, his voice strained. "I'm going in to release the chain." "Draco, no. If the spell slips, you'll be crushed." "Then don't let it slip, Granger." He didn't wait for her protest. He threw himself into the muck, crawling toward the thrashing, terrified beast. Hermione's vision blurred with the sheer force of the magic she was outputting. She could feel Draco's magic intertwined with hers, a silver thread woven through her gold, holding the weight of the world. She watched, her heart in her throat, as Draco reached the pinned paw. He didn't use his wand. He spoke to the dog, low, soothing words that were lost to the wind, and used his bare hands to guide the massive limb free as the rock lifted just enough. He then lunged for the hind leg, his fingers slick with blood and mud as he untangled the biting chain. "Now!" he roared. Hermione redirected her spell, slamming the boulder back into a stable section of earth. Draco rolled away just as the granite settled with a final bone-shaking thud. The beast was free. Fluffy limped back toward the center of the clearing, whining low in his throats before collapsing into a heap of exhausted, wounded fur. Draco lay in the mud, panting, covered from head to toe in filth and the blood of the dog. Hermione ran to him, dropping to her knees and pulling his head into her lap without thinking. "Are you okay? Draco, look at me." He opened his eyes. They were unfocused for a moment. Then they locked onto hers. He didn't pull away. He didn't sneer. He reached up, his muddy hand cupping her cheek, leaving a smear of dark earth against her skin. "You held it," he whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I knew you would." The warmth was back, a tidal wave that threatened to drown them both. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the cold reality of their situation returned. Draco's hand dropped. He looked at the dog, then at his own ruined clothes, and finally at the sky. The sun was setting on the 5th day. "We should get back," he said, his voice flat again, the walls sliding back into place with a terrifying, familiar thud. "Hagrid will be here the day after tomorrow. We need to be ready." He stood up, refusing her help this time. He walked ahead of her, his shoulders rigid, his silhouette dark against the orange sky. Hermione followed him, her heart breaking in a way she didn't know it could. They had just saved a life together. They had shared their magic, their strength, and their trust. And yet, as they reached the tent, she knew he was preparing to betray that connection one last time. He was going to retreat into the cold, and she was running out of time to stop him. The silence of the 6th morning was heavy, not with the hostile tension of the previous days, but with the suffocating weight of finality. The sun had breached the canopy of the forbidden forest, painting the interior of the tent in stripes of warm, golden light that felt cruelly cheerful given the turmoil churning in Hermione's chest. She sat on her cot, watching him. Draco was packing his belongings with a mechanical, obsessive efficiency. He folded his robes with sharp, precise movements, smoothing out wrinkles that didn't exist, his face a mask of impenetrable stone. He was already gone. He had retreated into that carefully constructed, untouchable version of himself, the Malfoy heir, the former Death Eater, the man who had something to prove and everything to hide. Every time she moved, every time the mattress creaked under her weight, he flinched, though he refused to look at her. It was a physical rejection, a wall of ice erected in the span of a single night. The warmth of the previous evening, the raw, bleeding honesty they had shared while patching up the beast, had been neatly folded away, tucked into the dark corners of his memory where he couldn't be touched by it. "You're doing it again," he said, not turning around. His voice was brittle, stripped of all the emotion that had been present when he spoke her name in the mud. "Doing what?" Hermione asked, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. "Pretending we're having a moment, pretending there's anything left to discuss." He stood up, hoisting his satchel onto his shoulder, his movements rigid. "The dog is stable. The ministry will be here by noon to check the wards and escort us back. The project is finished, Granger. We can stop performing for each other." The word performing felt like a slap. Hermione surged to her feet, the anger she had been suppressing all night flaring into a white-hot flame. Performance? You think what happened out there, the trust, the rescue, the honesty, was a performance? He finally turned to face her, his silver eyes cold, distant and agonizingly familiar. It was survival. People do strange things when they're afraid of dying. They reach for the closest hand. They say things they don't mean because the silence is too loud. He stepped toward the tent flap, his hand resting on the canvas, his posture screaming for an exit. "We're going back to a world where this doesn't exist, where you're the golden girl and I'm whatever the hell I am now. It's better if we just forget the forest ever happened." "I can't," Hermione said, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "I can't just flip a switch and turn off what I saw, Draco. I saw you. Not the mask. Not the heir. Not the enemy. I saw the person who plays the flute to soothe a broken animal because he knows what it feels like to be broken too." He spun around, the mask finally slipping. His expression was a volatile, terrifying mix of fury and raw, agonized yearning. "And what good does that do you? What good does that do us? You're acting like this is a fairy tale, like we can just walk out of these trees and everything is fine. You don't know what it's like to be me, to have every choice you make watched, judged, and condemned. I am toxic, Hermione. I am a remnant of a war that destroyed everything you stood for. I cannot be the person you want me to be. I don't want a saint, she shouted, closing the distance between them, ignoring the way he recoiled. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his sleeve, anchoring him in place. I don't want a hero, and I don't want an apology. I want the man who didn't let go of my hand in the mud. I want the man who admitted he was afraid to reach for me. It's a mistake, he choked out, his voice cracking. He tried to pull away, but she held firm. The seesaw was swinging wildly now, the cold of his rejection warring with the heat of his gaze. Everything about this is a mistake. It's a trick of the light, of the adrenaline, of the isolation. Then look at me, she demanded, her hands moving from his arm to his chest, right over his racing heart. Look at me and tell me it was a mistake. Tell me you didn't feel anything. Tell me you don't want to know what happens next. He looked down at her, his eyes searching hers, desperately trying to find a lie, a weakness, a reason to retreat. He was trembling. The impenetrable wall he had been building all morning was visibly cracking, the weight of his own desire crushing the defenses he relied on to survive. I can't, he whispered, the sound almost lost in the rustling of the wind outside. I can't lie to you. Not anymore. The admission hung in the air, heavier than the storm, more permanent than the trees around them. He collapsed against her, his forehead resting on her shoulder, his hands coming up to grip her waist with a desperate, crushing intensity. It wasn't the tentative touch of the cave. It was the touch of a drowning man finally reaching the surface. I've spent every second of this week terrified, he muttered into her hair, his voice muffled and raw. Terrified of this. Terrified of what you were doing to me. You crawled inside my head, Hermione. You dismantled every defense I had left. And now I'm standing here, exposed, and I have no idea how to exist like this. Hermione wrapped her arms around him, holding him close, feeling the jagged, uneven rhythm of his breathing. The cold was gone. The repulsion was dead. There was only the heat of their shared existence and the undeniable, terrifying truth that they had changed each other irreversibly. Then don't exist how you used to, she said softly, pulling back just enough to look up into his face. His eyes were dark, filled with a mixture of terror and a fragile, burgeoning hope. Start from here. Start from now. He stared at her, his lips parted, his gaze travelling over her features as if memorizing them for a time when he would be forced to be alone again. The tension that had defined their entire week, the constant, grinding friction of two opposing forces, was finally, irrevocably shifting into something else. They'll be here in 3 hours, he said, his voice quiet. I know. And then we're back to reality. Reality is what we make it, she replied, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, a long, shaky sigh escaping his lips. For the first time, he didn't pull away. He didn't build a wall. He stood there, vulnerable and real, allowing her to see the person he had been fighting so hard to keep hidden. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was expectant. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final act, for the inevitable conclusion to the slow, agonizing burn that had consumed them both for 6 days. Draco reached up, his fingers trembling as he brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the air between them grew thick, charged with an electricity that made her skin hum. He was scared. She could see it in the way his muscles were locked, the way he hesitated. But he was staying. He was choosing to stay. "I don't want it to end," he confessed, the words so quiet she almost missed them. "I don't want to go back to a place where you're not within reach." Hermione felt her heart soar, a sudden, blinding rush of joy that was tempered only by the looming reality of the outside world. But she didn't care about the world. Not right now. Not with him standing here, finally, truly present. "Then don't let it," she said, her voice a promise. He looked at her, and in the depths of his silver eyes, she saw the last of the ice melt. He didn't retreat. Instead, he tilted his head, his hands sliding to the back of her neck, pulling her just a fraction closer. But for this one, singular, suspended, but for this one, singular, suspended moment, there was only the two of them, a broken boy and a girl who refused to let him go, poised on the edge of a new reality. He didn't kiss her yet. He just hovered there, breathing her in, savoring the proximity, the permission, the sheer, impossible miracle of being seen. And Hermione knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that when the time finally came, when the ministry arrived, when the forest was left behind, nothing would ever be the same again. But for now, there was just the hum of the forest, the warmth of his body against hers, and the agonizing, perfect anticipation of what was to come in their final hours. The walls were gone. Now they just had to figure out how to live in the ruins. The final hour had arrived. Outside the tent, the forbidden forest was alive with the sound of approaching magic, the distant, sharp crack of apparition, the low hum of ministry officials resetting the perimeter wards, and Hagrid's booming voice echoing through the trees as he checked on his beast. The world was coming back for them, demanding they return to their roles, their reputations, and the rigid, unforgiving lines of post-war London. Inside the tent, time had slowed to a crawl. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the fading smell of the magical stove. But mostly, it was thick with the presence of Draco Malfoy. He was standing by the tent flap, his hand hovering over the fabric, but he wasn't looking out. He was looking at Hermione. The defensive, aristocratic mask he had worn for years was not just cracked. It was gone, discarded like the ruined robes from the mudslide. In its place was a raw, terrifyingly beautiful clarity. "They're here," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of the jagged edges that usually defined it. Hermione walked toward him, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She felt a strange sense of mourning. The forest had been a place of danger and filth, but it had also been the only place in the world where they could be themselves without the weight of 1,000 eyes watching for a misstep. "I know," she replied, stopping just a few inches from him. The proximity, which had once felt like a threat, now felt like an anchor. "Does it have to end, Draco? The way we are right now?" He let out a short, shaky breath, his eyes tracing every line of her face, as if memorizing a map. "I don't know how to be this person out there, Hermione. I've spent my whole life being a Malfoy, And then I spent my life being a ghost. This thing with you, it's the only real thing I've ever had. I'm afraid that as soon as we step across that ward line, the world will take it back. The world can't take what you don't give it, she said firmly, reaching up to take his hand. His fingers were cold, but they laced through hers with a desperate, crushing strength. You aren't a ghost anymore. I won't let you go back to being one. The seesaw of the week, the approach and the repulsion, the warmth and the ice, had finally stilled. They were balanced on the precipice of a terrifying new reality. The trust was no longer a tool for survival. It was the foundation of something far more dangerous. Draco's gaze dropped to her mouth, and the magnetic pull that had haunted them since the cave reached its breaking point. The tension was so high, it felt like static electricity dancing on their skin. "Hermione," he whispered, her name sounding like a prayer and a confession. He moved first. It wasn't the tentative, hesitant reach of a boy. It was the decisive, soul-deep surrender of a man who had nothing left to lose. He reached out, his large, pale hand cupping the side of her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone with an agonizing tenderness. He leaned down, and when his lips finally met hers, the world outside the tent simply ceased to exist. The first kiss was soft, a tentative question asked in the silence of the trees. It tasted of rain and cedar and the sweetness of a peace they hadn't yet earned. It was a slow, cautious exploration, a shattering of the final barrier. Hermione felt a soft gasp escape her throat, her hands flying up to catch the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer, needing to feel the solidity of him against the chaos of her thoughts. The second kiss was the answer. It was deep, desperate, and hungry. It was the release of 7 years of animosity, a year of war, and a week of suffocating proximity. Draco's arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her nearly off her feet as he pressed her back against the tent pole, his mouth devouring hers with a feverish intensity. It was the friction of his anger turned into passion, the coldness of his pride melted into a white-hot need. Hermione's fingers tangled in his silver hair, pulling him down, losing herself in the sensation of him. He was everything she shouldn't want. He was complicated, difficult, and scarred. But in the heat of his embrace, she knew he was exactly what she needed. He was the only one who truly understood the cost of the light, because he had lived so long in the dark. He pulled back for a second, his forehead resting against hers, both of them gasping for air. His eyes were wide, the silver darkened to charcoal, shimmering with an emotion so intense it was almost painful to look at. "I'm not going to be easy, Hermione," he whispered, his voice ragged. "I'm going to doubt you. I'm going to doubt myself. I'm going to want to run every time it gets too quiet. Then I'll just have to be louder," she replied, her heart overflowing with a fierce, protective love. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him again, a brief, firm seal of a contract. "You aren't doing this alone. That was the deal." A small, genuine smile, one that actually reached his eyes, flickered across his face. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, and finally gave her one last lingering press of his lips that felt like a promise of things to come. "Granger? Malfoy? You two still alive in there?" Hagrid's voice was much closer now, followed by the heavy thud of his boots just outside the tent. Draco let out a low, rueful laugh, his hands lingering on her waist for a heartbeat longer before he finally let go. He reached down, picked up his satchel, and straightened his shoulders. The armor wasn't back, but a new kind of strength was. A quiet, steady resilience. "Ready?" he asked, holding out his hand. Hermione took it, her fingers interlocking with his. She didn't care about the ministry officials. She didn't care about the whispers in the great hall or the letters from the prophet. She looked at the man beside her, the man who had played a lullaby to a monster and found his way back to the light. "Ready?" she said. Together, they pushed through the tent flap and stepped out into the sunlight. The forest was behind them. Fluffy was anchored and calm, his 3 heads resting in the grass as the ministry wizards worked. Hagrid beamed at them, oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere, his giant hand raised in a wave. They walked toward the ward line, their hands firmly clasped, their eyes fixed on the path ahead. The week was over. The task was done. But as they crossed the invisible boundary that separated the woods from the rest of the world, Draco didn't let go. He squeezed her hand, a silent, ironclad reassurance that the man she had found in the shadows was the man who was walking into the light. The story of the beast and the forest had ended, but as they reached the edge of the castle grounds, Hermione knew that the real story, their story, was only just beginning. The transition from the wild, primeval silence of the forbidden forest to the stone-cold reality of Hogwarts was like being plunged into a basin of ice water. The moment they stepped across the threshold of the Great Hall, the bubble they had inhabited for 7 days didn't just leak. It burst with a violent public finality. The ministry escort was efficient and cold. Draco was pulled to the right, toward a waiting group of stern-faced auras for his final probation debrief. Hermione was swept to the left, caught in the immediate suffocating whirlwind of Harry's relief and Ron's loud, frantic questions. "Hermione, you're filthy. Are you hurt? We heard the storm was a Category 5 magical surge." Ron was shouting, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes scanning her for wounds. "I'm fine, Ron. Really," Hermione said, but her eyes were darting over his shoulder, tracking the flash of platinum hair as Draco was led away. He didn't look back. His shoulders were rigid, his chin tilted at that familiar, arrogant angle that she now knew was a lie. The wall was up. The steel was back. The next 3 days were a masterclass in emotional whiplash. In the forest, they had been a binary system, orbiting a center of gravity made of raw necessity and unexpected tenderness. At Hogwarts, they were back to being 2 separate planets in a crowded, judgmental solar system. Hermione found herself back in the Gryffindor common room, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the familiar scent of old parchment. Yet she felt like a ghost. She would catch herself looking at the clock, wondering if Draco had eaten, or if he was staring at the walls of the Slytherin dungeon, feeling the same suffocating isolation she was. She saw him on the 2nd day, in the long gallery leading to the library. The seesaw tipped violently toward approach. Her heart leaped, her pace quickening, a greeting already forming on her lips. Draco. He didn't even slow down. He walked past her as if she were made of air, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his expression as flat and lifeless as a portrait. The repulsion was instantaneous, a physical blow to her chest that left her gasping. The warmth they had shared by the forest fire was replaced by a frost so deep it felt structural. He was doing it. He was retreating into the safety of the shadow. He was choosing the ghost over the man. Hermione spent the afternoon in a state of vibrating fury. She understood the fear. She understood that the world outside their tent was a jagged, cruel place for a Malfoy, but the betrayal of their shared honesty felt like a fresh wound. She wouldn't let him do it. She wouldn't let him crawl back into that cage and lock the door from the inside. That night, she didn't go to dinner. She waited until the corridors were near empty, the shadows long and flickering under the torchlight. She knew where he would be. Draco Malfoy didn't go to the Great Hall when he was bleeding. He went to the one place where the world couldn't find him. The room of requirement opened for her with a soft, yielding groan of wood. Inside, the space was small and sparse, a duplicate of their tent in the forest, but without the rain, without the beast, and without the hope. Draco was sitting on a lone chair in the center of the room, staring at the wooden flute in his hands. He didn't look up when she entered. "Go away, Granger," he said, his voice a low, raspy ghost of the one that had whispered her name in the mud. "No," Hermione said, slamming the door shut behind her. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to kiss me like the world is ending, and then treat me like a stranger in the hallway." "I told you," he said, finally looking up. His eyes were hollow, the silver tarnished by a deep, internalized shame. "I told you it was a mistake. I told you that out here I am exactly what they say I am. Look at you. You're the hero of the piece. You have a future. Every time someone sees you with me, a little bit of that light goes out. I won't be the reason you lose your place in the world. My place in the world is wherever I choose to stand," she shouted, stepping into his space, her hands clenched at her sides. "You think you're being noble, Draco. You think you're sacrificing yourself for my sake. You're being a coward. You're terrified of what happens if you actually try to be happy, so you're sabotaging it before someone else can take it away from you." Draco surged to his feet, the chair clattering backward. He dropped the flute, the wood hitting the floor with a dull thud. "And what if I am? What if I'm terrified of seeing the look in your eyes a month from now when the project is over and you realize you're tied to a man who has nothing to offer but a disgraced name and a haunted head?" "I am not a project hunter," she screamed back, her voice breaking. "I am a woman who sat in the mud with you and saw who you are when no one is watching. I saw the man who played music for a monster. I saw the man who put his body between me and a claw. That is the man I want. Not the Malfoy heir, not the Death Eater, and certainly not this pathetic, self-loathing ghost you're pretending to be." The silence that followed was thick with the residue of their shared history. The seesaw was balanced on a knife's edge. Draco was trembling, his chest heaving, his hands reaching out as if to touch her and then pulling back, caught in a loop of longing and revulsion. "I don't know how to do this, Hermione," he whispered, the defiance draining out of him all at once. He looked small in the vast, empty room. "I don't know how to be seen." "Then start by seeing me," she said, her voice softening as she closed the final gap between them. She took his hands, forcing him to feel the warmth of her skin. "I'm not going anywhere, but you have to decide if you're going to stay in this room or if you're going to walk out of it with me." He looked down at their joined hands. The internal monologue of his fear was visible in the way his jaw worked, the way his eyes searched hers for a lie he wouldn't find. Slowly, painfully, the ice began to crack. He didn't pull away. Instead, he gripped her hands so hard his knuckles went white. "It's going to be a disaster," he breathed, a ghost of his old sardonic wit flickering in his eyes. "Probably," Hermione agreed, a small, watery smile touching her lips. "But it'll be our disaster." She reached up, her fingers grazing his jaw, pulling him down toward her. This wasn't the desperate, world-ending kiss of the forest. This was a slow, deliberate pact. It was the warmth returning to stay. When his lips met hers, it felt like the first real breath she had taken since leaving the woods. The conflict of his shame hadn't vanished. Not yet. But the choice had been made. He wasn't going to retreat. "Stay with me tonight," he murmured against her mouth. "In here, where it's quiet." "Tonight," she promised. "But tomorrow we walk into the great hall together." He stiffened for a second, the old fear flaring, but then he let out a long, shaky sigh and nodded. He picked up the flute from the floor and tucked it into his pocket, a symbol of the parts of himself he was finally willing to keep. They sat together on the floor of the room that had become their sanctuary, leaning against each other as the candles flickered low. The world was still waiting outside, and the daily prophet was already sharpening its quills. But for now, the ghost was gone. There was only the heat of their bodies and the terrifying, beautiful realization that the hardest part wasn't surviving the beast. It was surviving the peace that followed. As the night deepened, Draco began to play a melody, one Hermione didn't recognize. It wasn't sad, and it wasn't a lullaby. It was a new song, tentative and bright, echoing through the empty room like a promise. She leaned her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes. The forest was far away, but the trust they had forged there was the only thing keeping them upright. They had 2 more chapters of their lives to write before the end, and for the first time, Hermione wasn't afraid of the ink. The sunrise on the morning of the press conference was a jagged line of gold cutting through a sky the color of a bruised plum. For Hermione, the Great Hall had become a battlefield of whispers. But today, the fight moved to the very heart of the wizarding world, the steps of the Ministry of Magic. The Daily Prophet had spent the last 48 hours dismantling Draco's life with the precision of a butcher. The headline, "The Lioness and the Serpent, a love potion or a lethal liaison," had been the final straw. It painted Hermione as a victim of a sophisticated, dark arts manipulation, and Draco as a predator who had used their isolation to ensnare the mind of a war hero. The social pressure was a physical weight, a crushing atmosphere that made even Ron and Harry walk on eggshells. "You don't have to do this, Hermione," Harry had said that morning, his green eyes filled with a quiet, protective concern. "We can just let it blow over. People forget." "People only forget when the truth is boring, Harry," Hermione had replied, her jaw set with a ferocity that silenced the room. "The truth about Draco Malfoy is many things, but it isn't boring, and I won't let them turn our survival into a scandal." Now she stood on the cold stone steps, facing a sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and the ozone of magical recording devices. Her heart was a drum in her chest, but her hands were steady. She looked out at the crowd, the judgmental faces of people who had never spent a night in the cold, who had never felt the hot breath of a three-headed dog on their neck, and she felt a sudden, clarifying surge of rage. "Silence!" she commanded, her voice amplified by a subtle sonorous. The shouting died down to a low, hungry murmur. "I am here today, not as a member of the Golden Trio, and not as a public servant," she began, her voice ringing out across the plaza. "I am here as a witness. For 7 days, I was tasked with supervising Draco Malfoy in the Forbidden Forest. The reports you have read are not journalism. They are fiction designed to feed a hunger for villainy that we should have left behind with the war." She spoke for 10 minutes. She didn't talk about romance. She talked about the mud. She talked about the way Draco had stood his ground when the chains snapped. She talked about the music that had saved their lives. She stripped away the Malfoy name and the Death Eater mark, and she presented them with the man who had bled into the dirt to keep her safe. "If you want to punish a man for his past, the Wizengamot has already done so," she finished, her eyes flashing. "But if you want to punish a man for surviving, for changing, and for showing a bravery that most of you will never be called upon to possess, then you will have to go through me." The silence that followed was absolute. Then a voice from the back of the crowd shouted, "Where is he then? If he's so brave, why is he hiding behind you?" Hermione's heart plummeted. She hadn't asked Draco to come. She had told him to stay at the manor, to wait until the storm passed. She knew how much he hated the eyes, the judgment, the way people recoiled when they saw the faded mark on his arm. Figure in a dark, impeccably tailored coat. Figure in a dark, impeccably tailored coat walked through the sea of reporters. Draco's face was pale, his expression a masterpiece of cold, aristocratic detachment, but his eyes were fixed entirely on Hermione. He didn't look like a victim, and he didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who had finally decided that the world's opinion was a price he was willing to pay. The seesaw tipped. The trust she had offered him in the forest was being returned in the most public, terrifying way possible. He walked up the steps and stood directly beside her. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers in front of every camera in London. The flashes were blinding. The noise was a roar. But in the center of the storm, Draco leaned in, his voice a low, steady anchor in her ear. "You talk too much, Granger." "And you're late, Malfoy," she whispered back, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to shed. "I had to find the right tie," he murmured, his thumbs stroking the back of her hand. Apparently, a unified front requires a certain level of aesthetic coordination. The tension in the crowd shifted from hostility to a stunned, buzzing curiosity. They were no longer looking at a predator and a prey. They were looking at a partnership. By standing there, by refusing to flinch, Draco had done the one thing the public never expected. He had shown them that he wasn't afraid of them. They didn't stay for the questions. Draco led her back toward the ministry doors, his grip on her hand never wavering. Once they were inside, shielded by the heavy oak doors and the silent, wide-eyed security guards, he finally let out the breath he had been holding. He leaned against the wall, his eyes closing, his face suddenly drained of color. "That was," he started, but he couldn't finish the sentence. "The bravest thing you've ever done," Hermione finished for him. She stepped into his space, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "You came." "I heard your voice," he said, opening his eyes. The silver was soft now, filled with a raw, dizzying warmth. "I was halfway to the flu to go to France. I told myself I was doing it for you, but then I realized that the only person I was protecting was myself. I spent my whole life being told who I was. I'm not letting a bunch of hacks in cheap robes tell me who I'm allowed to love." The word hit Hermione like a physical force. Love. They hadn't said it. Not in the forest, not in the room. It had been a ghost in the corner of the room, a presence they were both too terrified to acknowledge. Draco. "I know," he said, his hands coming up to cup her face. "I'm still a mess. I'm still a Malfoy. I'm still going to have bad days where I can't look at my own reflection. But if you're willing to stand on a staircase and yell at the world for me, the least I can do is stand there and hold your hand." He kissed her then, right there in the hallway of the Ministry of Magic. It wasn't a kiss of survival, and it wasn't a kiss of desperation. It was a kiss of defiance. It was the sound of 1,000 doors locking shut behind them and a single golden door opening ahead. The seesaw was no longer swinging. It had found its center. The cold repulsion of their past was being systematically overwritten by the heat of their present. As they walked through the ministry toward the apparition point, Ron and Harry were waiting. Ron looked at their joined hands, his face a complicated map of confusion, annoyance, and a slow, grudging acceptance. "The tie's a bit much, Malfoy," Ron muttered, though he didn't move to separate them. "It's silk, Weasley. I wouldn't expect you to understand the nuances." Draco fired back, but the bite was gone. Finally, painfully, coming back to life, finally, painfully, coming back to life. They stepped out into the crisp evening air, the world still buzzing, the headlines already changing. But for Hermione and Draco, the noise was just background static. They had one more chapter to write, one more place to go before the end. A place where the memories were the darkest and where the light was needed most. The gates of Malfoy Manor did not screech as they swung open. They moved with a silent, heavy grace that felt more ominous than any noise could have been. 6 months had passed since the press conference. 6 months of quiet battles, tentative dinners, and the slow, grueling process of public and private reconciliation. But today was different. Today, Hermione wasn't visiting a house. She was witnessing the reclamation of a home. The manor had always been a place of shadows for her, a place of cold marble, echoing screams, and the suffocating presence of a dark lord. But as she walked down the long gravel drive toward the sprawling gardens, she realized the shadows were retreating. The black ivy that had once strangled the stone walls had been cleared away, and the heavy, light-blocking charms on the windows had been lifted, allowing the pale afternoon sun to drench the drawing room in gold. She found Draco in the west garden, a section of the estate that had been a wasteland of scorched earth and dead briars since the war. Now it was a riot of colour. Foxgloves, snapdragons, and white roses bloomed in wild, untamed clusters, breaking the rigid, formal lines that the Malfoys had traditionally favoured. Draco was standing near a small, newly constructed stone alcove. He wasn't wearing his stiff, aristocratic robes. He was in a simple black sweater and trousers, his sleeves rolled up to reveal his forearms. The dark mark was still there, but it looked faded, a scar rather than a brand. He was holding the wooden flute, his fingers tracing the carvings. "You're late, Granger," he said without turning around, a ghost of a smile in his voice. "I was beginning to think you'd reconsidered the invitation to a den of iniquity." "I got caught up at the ministry," Hermione said, stepping onto the grass. The air here didn't smell like ozone and fear anymore. It smelled like damp earth and blooming jasmine. "Kingsley is pushing for the new creature protection laws, and I had to remind him that promptly doesn't mean next year." Draco turned to face her. The hollows in his cheeks had filled out, and the silver in his eyes was no longer cold. He looked alive, vibrant and steady in a way that still made Hermione's heart skip a beat. "Always fighting the good fight," he murmured, stepping toward her. He reached out, his hand sliding naturally into hers. "Even when the person you're fighting for is a three-headed dog with a temper problem." "He's doing well, you know," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Hagrid sent a Patronus this morning. Fluffy has settled into the new reserve in Greece. He's apparently taken a liking to the local sheep." "Better them than us," Draco said, pulling her closer. He led her toward the alcove. It was built of the same grey granite as the fissure in the forest, but instead of jagged, terrifying edges, the stone was smooth and covered in soft green moss. Inside, a small stone bench sat surrounded by flowers. "I built this for you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, vulnerable register. "A reminder, not of the fear, but of the moment I realized I didn't want to be a ghost anymore." The seesaw had finally found its equilibrium. The repulsion of their past was a distant memory, a foundation upon which they had built something far more resilient than the marble walls of the manor. Draco sat on the bench and pulled the flute to his lips. He began to play. The melody was the one he had started in the Room of Requirement, the one that wasn't a lullaby or a lament. It was a song of growth, of roots taking hold in difficult soil. The notes drifted through the garden, weaving through the roses and the sunlight, filling the space with a peace that felt hard-won and permanent. Hermione watched him, a profound sense of contentment settling in her chest. They weren't the people they had been 7 months ago. They were scarred, yes, and the world still looked at them with a mixture of awe and suspicion. But inside the gates of this garden, they were simply Draco and Hermione. When the music faded, Draco set the flute aside and looked at her. He didn't say anything for a long time, the silence between them comfortable and deep. "I used to hate this garden," he admitted, his eyes scanning the horizon. "My father used to walk here and talk about the purity of the bloodline, about the weight of the name. I thought the dirt was cursed. I thought anything that grew here was tainted because it belonged to us. And now?" He looked back at her, his expression filled with a raw, undeniable love. "Now, I think the dirt is just dirt. It doesn't care about names or marks. It just wants to grow something beautiful. And I think I'm finally ready to let it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming wooden box. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't make a grand, theatrical gesture. He simply opened it to reveal a ring made of dark, polished iron, set with a single, brilliant chip of white diamond. "It's not a Malfoy heirloom," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I had it made from the iron of the chain, the one that snapped in the forest. I wanted something that represented the moment we decided to trust each other when everything was falling apart. Hermione's breath hitched. She looked at the ring, then at the man who had survived the dark to give it to her. The iron was cold, but the sentiment was a bonfire. Draco. "I'm still difficult, Hermione," he said, a flash of his old self-deprecating humor returning. "I'm still going to be the person who complains about your book piles and your insistence on saving every house elf in Europe. But I don't want to do any of it without you." "Yes," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't care about the iron or the gold, Draco. I just want the man who stayed." He slid the ring onto her finger, the dark metal a stark contrast against her skin. It felt heavy and right. He pulled her into a kiss that tasted of the future, of a life lived in the sun, of a home built on the ruins of a fortress, and of a love that had been forged in the mud and the rain. Outside the gates, the wizarding world was still turning. There were still laws to pass, reputations to mend, and a history to reconcile. But in the garden of Malfoy Manor, the war was finally over. Hagrid's beast was safe in the sun, and the two people who had fed it were safe in each other's arms. The wooden flute sat on the stone bench, a silent testament to the music that can be found in the darkest of places. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the grass, Draco picked up the flute one last time. He didn't play a song of survival. He played a song of home. And as the notes drifted over the walls and into the forest beyond, Hermione knew that they hadn't just survived the week. They had found the life they were always meant to live.
Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Writing about Hermione and Draco is always a challenge. We know them as enemies, we know their history is full of pain, but I wanted to see what happened when you take away their world. In the forest there were no houses, no pure bloods, no war heroes. There was only the rain, a dangerous beast, and two lonely people. I believe that even the deepest scars can heal. Sometimes we need a crisis to finally see the person standing right in front of us. Draco found his voice through a wooden flute. Hermione found that her strength could be a bridge, not just a shield. To me, this story is about trust. It is about the courage to change your mind. I hope it reminded you that no one is truly a lost cause. If you enjoyed this journey, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I love reading them. Until the next story, goodbye.